Listen now as I read from the book of John, verses 6 through 20. I have made your name known to those whom you gave me from the world. They were yours, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Now they know that everything you have given me is from you. For the words that you gave to me I have given to them, and they have received them, and know in truth that I came from you, and they have believed that you sent me. I am asking on their behalf. I am not asking on behalf of the world, but on behalf of those whom you gave me, because they are yours. All mine are yours, and yours are mine, and I have been glorified in them. And now I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world, and I am coming to you. Holy Father, protect them in your name that you have given me, so that they may be one as we are one. While I was with them, I protected them in your name that you have given me. I guarded them, and not one of them was lost except the one destined to be lost, so that the scripture might be fulfilled. But now I am coming to you, and I speak these things in the world so that they may have my joy made complete in themselves. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. I am not asking you to take them out of the world, but I ask you to protect them from the evil one. They do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you have sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sakes I sanctify myself, so that they may also be sanctified in truth. I ask not only on behalf of these, but also on behalf of those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one. This is the word of the Lord.
So thank you to the bell choir. That was lovely. Well, I am always surprised when I come across a phenomenon in our culture that I didn't realize was a thing, but there are others who are very into it. And I was reading an essay online this week that Matt Seitz had written a few years ago, back in 2018, and he titled it, Overheard Lives, an Appreciation for Eavesdropping in the City. And he writes for a website called RogerEbert.com. And remember, Roger Ebert was a film critic. But Seitz says that few of the films or the TV shows that he writes about are as fascinating and full of unruly life as what he overhears each day in New York City. And he is referring to very brief snippets of conversation that he hears in his daily walk to and from his work or in other places that he might visit in the city. And he refers to these as Doppler moments because you begin to hear another conversation as you are coming up on the people talking, then you hear very clearly a brief part, and then maybe just a couple of lines, and then the words are fading away as you are walking away from it. So that's the Doppler moment. But what you hear, with no context, of course, at all, can be astounding. So just for example, he walked in to buy a pastry at a bakery and overheard two young men at the other end of the counter ordering a cake. And what he heard was one of the men asking if the decoration on the top could include the phrase, "Sorry that we stole your car." So another time, he and his young son were talking. And as they were walking along, and he said, you know, some characters shouldn't be called superheroes because they don't actually have superpowers, like Batman. And his son said, Dad, Batman has a superpower. It's money. And a man passing them just began to laugh. And Seitz realized then that they had been somebody else's Doppler moment. So now there are websites where people can submit what they have overheard for the enjoyment of others. Now, one site is called Overheard in New York City. Another is the New York Times column called Metropolitan Diary. And there's even in the New Yorker, there's this column called Talk of the Town. Well, I ran across this article because commentaries that I was reading, trying to prepare for this sermon, were talking about this prayer that we heard some of earlier between Jesus and God, but they were saying that the disciples were meant to overhear it. Now, through the season of Lent, we've been looking at some of the prayers of the Bible, and some of these were ones that we knew, and some maybe we had not heard before. And if we were answering a trivia question, what is the greatest prayer of the Bible? Most of us would probably say the Lord's Prayer, the one that Jesus taught his disciples when they asked, "Lord, teach us to pray." And this is very familiar to us, and we have had other opportunities to look into that prayer at different times. But the one that we are finishing up with today is the other Lord's Prayer. Another, less known, less repeated, certainly less memorized Lord's Prayer. So this is in the Gospel of John, and it's from that part of John that scholars call the farewell discourse. It is Holy Week, and Jesus and his disciples are in Jerusalem eating the Passover meal. And Jesus is preparing his disciples, his friends, for his eventual death. They will need to know how to preach the gospel without him. So he spends what amounts to about 4 chapters preparing them for what comes next. Now, it was an eventful night in the upper room. Jesus had washed their feet. He had taught them about being a servant. He reminded them that he will guide them as a shepherd guides sheep, and that they are so close to him that they are like branches on the vine that is Christ. And he made sure that they knew that God would abide in them just as God abided in him. And they will be able to preach the gospel because Jesus will abide in them as well. And he tells them to love each other. And then he goes into this prayer. That is the last part of the farewell discourse. But this prayer is as much a model for prayer as the other more known one. In fact, one writer said that the prayer that we have memorized and that we say or sing each week should be called not the Lord's Prayer, but the disciples' prayer. It's how Jesus taught the disciples to pray. But when Jesus finished what he wanted to say to his disciples, he turned to God in what is the longest prayer that we have from Jesus. Now, the biblical scholar Walter Wink wants us to be sure that we see what is happening here. He says, the holy torch is being passed. Jesus is retiring, leaving the family business to a dubious band of followers. The responsibility for God's mission in the world is being passed from Jesus to the disciples. So what is happening in this monumental prayer that is essentially wrapping up 3 years? And what is it that he wants his disciples to overhear as he talks to God? Well, this prayer has 3 parts in it, and we did not read the entire prayer this morning. In the first 5 verses, Jesus is praying for himself. That very first verse says, Father, the hour has come. Father, Abba. He addresses God with familiarity, with a relationship. Father. And we are invited to call God the same. Our Father who art in heaven. But then he says next, I have brought you glory on earth by finishing the work you gave me to do. Now, glorify me with the presence I had in you before the world began. So remember how the Gospel of John begins. In the beginning was the Word, capital W, meaning Logos, meaning Jesus. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So then he goes on to the second part. Verses 6 through 19, Jesus is here praying for his disciples. So repeatedly, Jesus acknowledges how dangerous the world is and that the one that he's going to be leaving these disciples in. And listen to these words. Holy Father, protect them so that they may be one as we are one. Protect them. This is what we want, right? We want protection from hurtful people, from disease, from painful relationships. But even after this prayer, according to what we know, John is the only disciple who did not meet a violent death because of his faith and his ministry. But maybe Jesus is seeing our need for protection in a different way. Maybe Jesus' prayer is for the disciples to stay grounded in his teachings so that they can face the self-centered values of the world and be protected from the temptations to buy into some kind of a misguided definition of success. So he prayed for himself, and he prayed for his disciples who are overhearing this prayer. Now, all of his words are worthy of time and study to discern what they mean. But for today, we are focused on the third part of his prayer. He said, I am not just praying for these followers. I am also praying for everyone else who will have faith because of what my followers will say about me. I want all of them to be one with each other. Just as I am one with you and you are one with me, I also want them to be one with us. Now, Jesus has confidence that the disciples will absolutely carry on his mission, that the church will grow wider and deeper and will grow through the centuries. And his prayer is that all, God, Jesus, all the faithful, will be one. We will be in his heart, and he will be in ours. So in his final hours on earth, Jesus is praying that even with our eyes wide open after eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that we will put aside our differences and forgive our enemies and welcome outsiders and make sure we honor and respect everyone, acting as peacemakers, providing healing for the broken, refuge for the impoverished, the marginalized, the outsider, the immigrant, and the refugee. This was his prayer for us the night before he died. So, how are we doing? If we only go by the headlines that are relentlessly pounded into our ears and our eyes, it doesn't look good. Wars, climate concerns, political alliances that make us nervous, discord in public conversation, residual COVID scares. It doesn't look good. But if Jesus prays a prayer for us, then there is more going on than wishful thinking. The Spirit was promised. The Spirit came, and the Spirit continues to work, sometimes in obvious ways and sometimes behind the scenes. So these are news stories from just the last 2 weeks. A man named Felix Brooks Church has invented a small machine known as a dosifier, which adds vitamin B12, zinc, folic acid, and iron to flour sold by local millers in southern Africa. It is super simple technology, but the impact is enormous, with each machine plugging into local distribution channels that reach of thousands of people, adding life-saving nutrients to the foods that they are going to eat the most of. At this time, they have installed dosifiers in 800 flour mills. More than 97% of people worldwide now have some level of immunity against COVID-19, either from having had the infection and therefore have some resistance, or by being vaccinated. Over 5.5 billion people, almost 70% of humanity, have actually had the vaccination. Easily the largest, fastest, and most successful campaign in the history of global public health. The global inventory of nuclear weapons has declined by more than 80% since the Cold War, from a peak of 70,300 in 1986 to 12,700 in 2022. Michigan just passed a law protecting LGBTQ citizens. Minnesota has become the 4th state to provide free meals to all school children. New Mexico has passed a law that prohibits life imprisonment for juvenile offenders. Arizona has pioneered an urban food forest that has become a model for climate action. California just announced a program to cut the number of unsheltered people by 15% in the next 2 years. An Egyptian startup is tackling ocean pollution by turning plastic bags into outdoor paving tiles that are tougher than cement. The United States has 2 new national monuments. Kastner Range National Monument in Texas, made up of 6,600 acres of rugged canyons and arroyos, and Aviquama in Nevada, comprising 500,000 acres of the most biologically diverse and culturally significant lands in the Mojave Desert, including 28 species of native grasses and some of the oldest Joshua trees in the country. People who mistreat domestic animals in Spain will face much tougher penalties following new legislation. The law requires compulsory training for dog owners and aligns with the country's shift in 2020 to recognize animals as living beings endowed with sensitivity rather than simply seeing them as things. These are all good news headlines, and they all relate to Jesus' prayer that all may be one, because everything is interconnected. We are one with each other and with God when health care is available to all. We are one when all are fed and all have the nutrients that we need to thrive. We are one when we take seriously the role of being good stewards of our planet. We are one when we provide for our children both physically and emotionally. These headlines that we don't get to hear about are amazing, and they are happening all the time. We're not ignoring the bad, divisive news, but we are simply here acknowledging that there are those who are paying attention to the value that we heard in Jesus' prayer to work for the betterment of humankind. So we are glad to hear when they pass beneficial laws. We're glad to hear when they are doing something to protect the environment. We are glad when they discover the vaccine for COVID or some new disease. But this is a prayer that came down through the centuries, landing now in your ears and in mine. In our corners of the world, in our families, in our workplaces, in our schools, we should be all about being unifiers and not dividers. Jesus prayed for us on that night. So we have a role in all of this. And our role is to take a worldview, a value, a perspective that is so intrinsic in our nature that we live and breathe it and bring it into every relationship and every encounter. It is an appreciation for the diversity around us and a recognition that difference is a good thing and not a threat to us. It's an openness to others and to sense that when another is hurting, we are hurting because we are one. That is the value that we hold. Now, I am fascinated with the culture of the Kennedy family, the John, Robert, Ted, that family. The children and the grandchildren were and still are instilled with the Kennedy worth ethic and a commitment to public service. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend described summers at Hyannisport with her 28 cousins as a disciplined summer camp with tennis and sailing and swimming and softball games, all in a schedule. Each night at dinner, she recalled, every child had to discuss one current event. And sometimes the dinner topic of conversation would be posted on with a thumbtack on the bulletin board in the kitchen. The Kennedys were taught as children and genuinely believed that American citizenship was a special privilege and honor, in return for which every citizen had an obligation to serve and help their country. So now, virtually all the cousins are involved in some degree with nonprofit organizations connected to the family, especially the John F. Kennedy Library, the RFK Memorial, and the Special Olympics. So this is all good. But what interests me is the intentionality of year after year learning a value so completely that it comes naturally to how you approach the decisions you make in your life. So how do you and I develop a culture of unity in the circles where we move and where we have influence? With consistency and intentionality. And first, we pray as Jesus did for unity and for our own relationships as well as for others. And it means that we listen. We seek to understand another's perspective and listen without judgment or defensiveness. It means that we cultivate compassion, creating an environment where people feel secure and accepted. It means that we practice humility. We let go of our egos. We admit when we are wrong. And it means that we practice gratitude. When we are grateful for the people in our lives, we are more likely to treat them with kindness and respect, which builds unity. And so we start with our innermost circle of influence, maybe at home or within our circle of friends or here at the church, and we challenge divisive talk. We know our children are watching us. We know that they are overhearing us. And we bring with us into every situation the culture of unity and diversity. We are so steeped in our focus on being one with each other and one with God that this shapes our conversations and our decisions. This was what was on Jesus' heart the night before he died. And we are meant to overhear it 2,000 years later. It was his prayer for you and for me that all would be one. Let it be so. Amen.